Okay, I think we're recording. All righty, does this look here? Tia,
Yeah,
can you hear
looks
me?
good.
Does it
Looks
look all
good.
right? You can just see only the screen and not the other stuff that's up on my screen?
That's correct.
Okay, good to go. All right. So I guess just wanted to get into stuff that like I know the most intimately and most familiar with in a lot of ways here. And I mean, and that's trees. I'm still learning about turf and all the little nuances of different types of gardening and stuff like that. But this is the world that I've been in for the past, 7 or 8 years. And so I guess like a lot of the management that involves trees is why do we have problems with them? And let's see. Sorry, I was just admitting the last few people coming on here. I guess Tia couldn't see them. But anyway.
Yeah, no, I couldn't see them.
All right. Well, I think that I'm done admitting people at this point. So at any rate, I just wanted to like get into this world of arboriculture and try and give you guys some perspective on what arborists deal with from day to day. I mean, trees are still part of the landscape and gardening, but it tends to be a very specified field. And like the knowledge about trees, it doesn't always make it out into like the general practitioners of gardening, landscaping, that type of thing. As you know, there's lots of people that manage trees that really don't even do a good job at it. And so my goal here is trying to get you guys like some of that basic knowledge and just think about trees a little bit differently and kind of see the world the way that like a trained arborist would see it a little bit. So with that, I'll jump into it here. And I mean, the big thing that we have to deal with, the reality in Florida, is that we have storms and there's constant pressure on trees to deal with that force of nature. Up north, you might have ice storms and stuff like that, and the how they deal with that, physically is a little bit differently than what the storms we encounter are. But a lot of the concepts are still the same, and there's a lot of good research out there that have looked at tearing trees apart and like the physics behind how trees can resist all these forces. So let's see. So to start out, I just want, like to talk about like how to understand a trees. We need to talk about like their structural terminology. It would be a little bit like trying to have a conversation to people about moving. I mean, without defining what a foot or a leg is. So obviously we all know trees like are composed, that is the trunk is the main leader, or what we would also call this as a leader. And the trunk is a little bit more towards the base here. But that stem moves up all the way through the tree. Now, some trees can have multiple leaders too, which I'll get to, and why that might not be an ideal situation. But, in some of the, like where the leader branches off into multiple leaders, we call this a whorl or a branch cluster. So, and then any branch that comes off of this main leader, we call that a scaffold or a main limb. And you can see here that like there are different ratios like that of the limbs, what the limb has relative to the dominant leading stem. So generally in this world that, we try to look at this ratio a lot because a lower ratio means a lot more strength. if I were here in person, I would show you, or if we were all in a classroom, I would try and show you like how breaking a stem apart, like if you find two pieces of branches, two branches that arc and like are roughly the same size, they break apart much more easily than if you have a branch with with a much smaller stem attached to it, or a much smaller branch coming off of it. So anything with these large aspect ratios, above 3:5 ratios, like you're getting into territory of the branch not being very strong relative, that union not being very strong relative to these smaller unions I was just showing you. So in nature, we have to be reminded sometimes that trees grow very differently in forests than what we see day to day in urban environments. And, and a lot of that has to do with like that they are growing in nature upward and trying to reach the light in the canopy. A lot of times the light is only in one particular spot and they have to grow upward to get that. So what happens is they develop a really strong central leading stem, and they don't really have a choice in it but to grow vertically. So this is over time here you can kind of see that this tree is just kind of grown upward. And if you can also imagine, a tree in a forest would be touching other trees as well. It would be able to support itself not only through this central stem, which is very strong, but it would also be able to rely on the other trees around it. And like that, the force of the mass of the tree would be able to be supported by these other trees as well. So in urban environments, this is typically not the case. We typically, what happens is like the trees are surrounded by light. They're not competing with other trees for the light. And so that in a sense, the competition for light becomes happens between the branches as opposed to the tree competing with other trees. So like you are constantly, these trees that are in these urban environments, they grow outward. So you can see this, the tree in the last slide was 60 feet, but it probably has equal mass and relative to this tree over here, which is only 5 feet or so at maturity. So, and when you have this happen, this tree is just, it's much structurally less like able to deal with force relative to trees that have a lot of their growth focused on one central leader. When you have a weak central leader and then lots of scaffold branches with that high ratio, like of branch to stem ratio, like those are really weak unions. So what can potentially make this worse? Well, I'll get to that, but you can see in nature here that what happens with strong form, you can still have that with trees that have this more pyramidal shape. We call this an excurrent shape. And like, so here you've got a magnolia, but you might also have some of the other trees that tend to do this are sycamores and cypresses. A lot of your evergreens, your conifers like cypresses, the Nagi podocarpus is one of the ones that like we like to promote that grows in this form. And it's just much more structurally able to deal with the wind because it has a lot of branches, smaller branches that are on this one central main leader. And unfortunately, this contrast to a lot of the, are more, we call these trees that have a more circular ball shape to them, we call that decurrent. And they're just much more likely to divide their resources into these, different branches that can get very large. And consequently, the joints where they connect to the central leader are oftentimes very weak. So I guess something I want to point out here is that it's still possible to train trees with this tendency to grow to current shape, you know, this ball-like shape that we see with live oaks a lot of times. You can see here, this is a live oak. You can train them to still have a very strong central leader growing up it. And like, it otherwise wouldn't, like without a lot of like arboricultural pressure from people managing it. Unfortunately, you know, this, I guess in this circumstance here that I'm pointing out to the left, this tree has been maintained all throughout its life, like to keep this form. But what is more often the case is what you see on the right, is that people are reacting. They are trying to, the trees are not actively managed throughout the course of their life. And consequently, if something goes on here where the branches are like the vegetation is removed because people think that this is a good idea to deal with wind and other pressures. So I mean, and you can see the trees on the right here, they're much more susceptible to pressures, and I'll get into that in a little more detail, like wind pressure and that type of thing. So how do trees deal with a lot of resist the forces that are placed on them? Each branch on the tree to the left here, this live oak, is more susceptible to failure and breakage due to that poor ratio than these branches that are on the tree to the right. And oh, and so just to kind of revisit that aspect ratio that I was talking about, the branches and the stems with large aspect ratios are actually more susceptible to breakage, which doesn't always seem the most intuitive, but it's kind of a due to the connections that are internal and also just kind of due to the physics of how connections work. So just in contrast here, if the stem is already much larger, like the branch will grow slower, like with this, when you have a branch that is small. And the branches or the stems that are large or similar size will grow faster because they're kind of competing with each other for resources. They have an equal access to the resources, to light and what's coming from below ground. And so what happens, I mean, so this is just a comparison in how they're kind of made up throughout the course of the entire tree, these two different types of attachments. So if you do have these small aspect branches, like they're stronger to begin with because like of it being supported by the main stem, but then also something that happens is that the main stem tends to envelop the entire branch, and like that connection like increases with age. And so like as you see here on the lower right hand side, that's what this branch bark union or this branch stem union kind of looks like. And here's just another perspective illustrating that, like with a tree that has had its bark removed. You can see that the union is just enveloped by the tree and that it's very, very strong. So I just kind of wanted to point out here that the union, like within these stems or codominant stems that we call them, like is internally it's shared. And so here's a cross section that you can see the different, we call the very internal part of the branch or the stem, in this case, the pith. So if you can imagine where I'm pointing right here with the cursor, if you were to cut it right there, this is what it would look like on the left-hand side. And when you put pressure on one stem, like it actually goes through the entirety of the stem here, of both stems. And instead of like a branch being supported by one larger stem, you're actually driving a wedge somewhat between the two stems. And so this is why a lot of times these unions are considered to be high risk in a lot of senses, because they do not have very good mechanics to hold up under very high stressful situations, under high loads. So, and you can see this circumstance right here, there wasn't even bark included. And that can be a lot of the time that you see these codominant stems, there's no bark. And that's actually relatively strong. It's not ideal, but it's not as bad as it can be. And I'll show you right here. This is not what you want. And this, unfortunately, in Florida, with live oaks and a lot of the species we have here, this is a very common occurrence, that the branches diverged very early on, and you had two different stems that were competing with each other for codominance, and then the tree keeps growing, and all this time you can see that there is bark included here all the way up, that they're growing into each other. So here's a cross section that kind of illustrates that. You can see that this is the bark inclusion, and that's what it looks like internally as the tree grows. Sometimes the trees can overcome these unions a little bit, but it's still not ideal in terms of the trees being structurally sound. And eventually you can see this, occur, and the consequences of this with this discoloration here. A lot of times these areas collect water, and it becomes an easy way for decay to develop. Like pathogens are able to work their way into that pretty easily, and it's an ideal environment for them to proliferate because of the fact that it's wet a lot of the time. So yeah, I mean, here's an instance where you had this happen all the way at the beginning of this tree, where it was two stems from the very beginning, and you could see included bark is all the way through it. And eventually it will fail, because a house divided cannot stand in one tree. So ideally, like, it should have been at the very beginning just one stem to begin with, but this happens a lot of the time. With live oaks and other trees that tend to have decurrent growth patterns. So let's just talk about another way that the trees can resist the forces that are put on them is through taper. So you can see I've got two instances where, when you have a force like wind hitting a tree that's highly tapered, that force is able to be distributed much more evenly throughout this stem on the left here. If you have something that is of uniform width all the way across, you tend to have something that happens a lot of times is that that force tends to be focused at the base. And this is kind of what it would look like if the wind hits it. This tree on the left here with a much more taper is able to bend somewhat with it, the way the fibers are set up. Whereas these trees with uniform taper, without much of it, it tends to focus at the base. So a separate issue, and this is a little bit bigger picture on how entire trees are able to resist force, is the concept of damping. And it's the same concept that we have for tall buildings to resist earthquakes. Is also something that trees can utilize as well. So like if you're in areas where you have earthquakes, you have these buildings, and something that's built into them a lot of the time is a hanging mass damper. So big weight basically towards the top of the building. So if the building is forced, if something happens and the building is forced in a certain direction, the building will move in this instant right, but the mass remains in place as the structure is forced that way. And then the building recovers, but the mass will swing right in compensation. So let me see if I can pull up the video here. I'm gonna skip the video for now, and I'll give you a link to it later. So something that we have to keep in mind here is that that wind, oftentimes it isn't uniform across the entire tree. It's actually, there might be other obstructions. There might be just gusts, individual gusts that are not, a very big diameter. But the way that we tend to think about it in terms of these structural aspects of, is that they travel kind of in tubes that come across the trees, the canopies. So as you can see here, these trees that even when they're decurrent and like not having ideal form, what happens a lot of the time is that force that comes in through these tubes in one part of the tree is able to be distributed. And this is the damping effect, like on other parts of the branches, like in other secondary and tertiary branches are able to absorb that impact. It's mainly getting the tops of the trees where that force is kind of focused. Oop. And so that means like that the breakage, there's less likelihood of it occurring because of that force being distributed. So in Florida, what we see a lot of times, and unfortunately it happens a lot of times right before hurricanes, is that there is a lot of force, there is a lot of people that go out and trim trees in order to reduce the likelihood, or so they claim, of the trees kind of acting as a giant sail and creating an instance where the canopies will have branches that break off. They think that what you see here, when you remove all this lower branches throughout the tree, that somehow allows the tree to better withstand the wind. In actuality, like there is nowhere for this force to go. Like when they do this, you've basically taken the tree's ability to perform mass damping away. And instead, what happens is like all that damping that would have been going on is focused more on these unions and makes them much more susceptible. So when you have these wind tubes occur at the tops of the trees, all of that pressure, all that force, it's just you're forcing it all the way to where the branches has a union. And unfortunately, this tree has been trained and grown in instances where it previously had a lot of other branches to help distribute the force. And so these unions are even weaker as a consequence of growing that way. So they're even more susceptible now to hurricane force winds and things like that, to breakage, than if those branches had been left in place, the smaller branches that formed the entirety of the canopy. So just to do a little bit, to think about this a little bit in terms of quantity, the idea of force, like this is the general amount of pressure, weight collectively that's applied to the tree. And then what you have in a lot of cases, like where the force is, ends up at, either at the ground or at the moment or at the branch union. We call this the moment. And you also have and what factors into all of this is the length of the branch or the entire body of the tree in some instances. So that bending moment, it's stronger the longer that that lever arm is. So the force times the distance of the lever arm will create an even stronger moment. So it's kind of the same principle, you know, of levers. That the longer the lever you have, the less force you have to apply to turn things. It's the same principle here for trees and able to knock them over. So large aspect ratio, like we talked about, this tree right here has a large aspect ratio. It has basically 3 codominant stems, low branches that are extended up very high, and all the lower lateral branches were removed. So with all that, you've got this large aspect ratio, very long arm, 25 feet, and then you've got a moment. You know, the force like of that branch is one, you know, just for an example, we'll say 100 pounds by 25 feet. Like right there at that moment, it's 2,500 pounds. So, and then the stress of all that is the moment times the branch radius, and then times 0.25 times pi in the branch radius, and then like that's how you get at the overall stress. So anyway, what ends up happening in a lot of cases is this isn't the same tree, but it would be a pretty similar situation for what the example was, that the breakages usually occur between the branches and not so much like at the base of the trees. It can happen, but it's just much more the way that we culturally prune trees here, like I've been pointing out, like it just forces a lot of pressure on the unions between larger branches and the stems. So as like this, I think this photo is from Singapore, and I guess a big analysis of like they do have a lot of tropical pressure from hurricanes, cyclones, I believe, and like typhoons, and 78% of the breakages that they've had in these urban areas were due to branch failures and not like the overall trunk failing. So I guess in review, what causes trees to fail? Mostly poor structure and mechanics. And there are a lot of different individual types of risk features, but I just wanted to point these out, like you know, these very large stems and codominant stems and large branches are, in a sense, like they're risk features, and they're very, very prevalent throughout the landscape. So, and in particular, the ones that have included bark are pretty bad. So, and then on top of that, you know, what makes this poor structure worse that you have like in urban environments where you have these decurrent branches that are large and competing with each other? It's when you remove all of the minor secondary and tertiary branches throughout the lateral branches, what we would call those, and you leave, you try and clear it up, and a lot of times like you've made the situation worse, because what's left of the canopy, all the weight and force that can be applied to them, it can be moved, all that force just move, you've created a big lever arm, and a new means, well, an even easier means for the tree to have it like be impacted by storms. So this is where I would go into a whole different spiel on pruning and everything else, like and lead into that, like how we can resist it. But I just want to be like emphasize the fact that there is a way, there is a solution to this, and it's kind of like not the easy solution. It's just like integrated pest management. The big picture is what's important, like, and controlling many different aspects of the equation that can lead to a problem, like in pest management, can eventually lead to a situation that is very difficult to control for. And usually, like, it would have been easier to control these individual aspects. So in this case, controlling for, like, at different courses of points in time, pruning the tree to have this better form, as opposed to trying to correct it later on in life when the bad form has already been developed. So if you were able to create a tree with good form through good arboricultural practices, and just paying a little more attention to it while it's young, then, like, when you can give it better form and give it a better chance of living a longer life later down the road, even while it's mature. So just to kind of point out the different points of a tree life cycle, when trees are young, they respond much more easily to pruning and, like, treatments that we apply to them, and they're able to create like growth wood in response. Like, they're able to um, like grow a form, grow in the direction that you try and put pressure on them to grow in. But if you don't apply any of these, or this could be arborists or whoever that manages trees, landscapers, if you put them in, we have this idea that trees can kind of just take care of themselves, and that they're able to grow the right way. And, like, as I mentioned, in urban environments, this isn't always the case. Like, they want the branches will they want to, their goal is to suck up as much light as possible and create and absorb as many resources as possible. And a lot of them just don't have the genetics to, or natural, I guess, their nature to grow in a form that's ideal for resisting stresses later on, like from wind and that type of thing. So you get these situations where these branches are all competing with each other if they're not pruned early on. So, and so this is what it looks like. This is the same tree, like that on the right-hand side as it matured. And you can see the aspect ratio of these stems is very large, and it could have been controlled earlier on if people had been more attentive to it. So, and the consequences of this are like, trees are just much more susceptible a lot of the time to breaking later on, like particularly during events like where there's a lot of force put on them. So that's it. I just wanted to give you guys an introduction to tree structure and how we think about tree risk and storms and all that in Florida, and without trying to get you too confused. So with that, let me see if I can pull up questions. Okay, if you got questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Okay, from Heather, should we trim all trees like this, even fruit trees? Well, and how does the affect how much the fruit can grow and how hard it is to get to it? So my response to that is, fruit trees, you don't have to think about this so much, because fruit trees tend to be pretty small. They tend to breed them to be dwarfs a lot of the times. And, like, if you're more worried about being able to access the fruit a lot of the times than for being able to get than for the tree growing very large and potentially falling on your house. So I think that is, I'm answering your question. There are some instances where mango trees and things like that can be very large, and you might want to try and structurally prune them like accordingly if you don't want them to fall on something. But I think that overall, fruit trees, you would try and prune them in a way that like would maximize the amount of fruit you get from them, as opposed to pruning them for trying to avoid risk. Is the science for this developed from analyzing trees that have failed? Yes. In a sense, they do a lot of experiments pulling trees apart. Like for instance, like I was talking about those different types of branch unions. Some of the experiments, what they'll do is um, they'll set up lever, they'll attach big winches to different stems on different parts of the tree and see how they respond to the stress. They've shown that branches that grow much more vertically, as opposed or less, much more horizontally as opposed to vertically, for example, have much more tolerance for stress. I think it's almost double, based on like some of the, 15-degree versus like a 75-degree. I think that 75-degree angle, growing in relation to the stem has twice as much ability to endure force. So there's lots of stuff out there. Ed Gilman was, the big name in arboriculture, was up at University of Florida. He's actually the one that I adapted this talk from, like taking his class. And I think that like he did a lot of work using big hurricane simulators against different types of trees, and then from there they were able to figure out, based on that and some of the data they've collected from post-hurricane data and tree inventories and that type of thing, which trees are able to endure stress, which shapes are able to endure stress that we encounter here. So there's a lot of resources out there, and I'll go ahead on my follow-up here. I'll give you guys an email soon. I'll try and attach some of the resources that relate to this. I mean, it's pretty relevant to where we live, and we are entering hurricane season here. So what is the best time to start, Peggy says, when is the best time to start pruning non-flowering trees? How old or the size of the tree? Best time to start pruning structurally is probably like a year or so out after you've had the tree established. You want to give the tree, particularly when it's young, a chance to like get situated and for its roots to grow, and you don't want to impact where it's able to basically feed itself from its leaves. So about a year out after the tree has been established on site, you can start pruning it. And that maybe that's something that I'll have to save for down the road in more detail on how to properly prune small trees and establish them so that they'll have better form. So I have a Royal Poinciana with 2 codominant trunks. Should I prune one trunk and let the other take over? Well, there's a lot of things that go into that. If the tree is already very mature, it's probably best just to leave the tree the way that it is at this point and just accept that risk that's already involved there, unless there's the potential for that tree to like fail over something that, it might be very sensitive, like if it were growing right over your house or over your carport or something. Otherwise, it's probably better just to leave it alone. You're going to cause more damage in the long run to that tree if you try to take out these dominant trunks. And that's why it's very important early on to prune it as opposed to later on in its life. So can you produce a diagram of the parts of the tree that we could use in the plant clinic? I could. So okay, anything else? Let me see if I missed anything. You mentioned something from Phyllis. You mentioned something about bark being bad. I didn't understand the type of bark that you're talking about. The type of bark that's bad is bark that is actively included in those branch unions or stem unions. We call this included bark, and it's bad because the tree has you're essentially, there's a permanent opening that is the result of that bark touching each other, and that bark also, it doesn't live, like it dies like as well in there, and it becomes a source of potential decay later on because of that opening, and like that dead growth is or that dead carbon in there becomes a source of food for um, like pathogens that can cause further decay and reach other parts of the tree. Okay. Are we still advising plant clinic clients to contact an arborist? Yes, definitely. So, okay, I'm going to wrap up that part, like the questions here, and I just wanted to bring up a few points. I guess basically a mini meeting here for a mini lunch and learn. Sorry if I haven't been able to get to some of your emails. I've got a few, I know there's a couple that have been on the back burner here for me. I've got my hands pretty full running the clinic, in addition to all the programming pressure that we've got, and what they're trying to get us to do in terms of interacting with, doing things within the state, trying to stay on top of like all the training that they're giving us right now and over Zoom and things like that, on how to handle all these different types of media and this new digital environment that we find ourselves. So, and it's been picking up a lot lately. Like actually, like the plant clinic, I've been getting a lot more calls over the past couple of weeks than I had at the beginning of the COVID situation. I guess another thing is that I will be having a meeting with Wendy and all the other Master Gardener coordinators throughout the state on Friday. And so I'll have a lot more information on a timeline and that type of thing for like when we, for an idea of like what we can be doing as we slowly return to more, different phases of normalcy here. And I'll have a guideline for you probably after talking to Wendy. I know that I've talked to Ed today, and he kind of gave me a rough timeline already for certain things within extension in general that we're looking at, and so I think we're going to be kind of on something similar. And so with that said, there was I guess, okay, so next week's lunch and learn. Thanks for showing up. This had a lot more participants than I thought that we would get. I thought we might have like 40 or 50, but got like double almost what I expected. And your speaker next week will be Tia. And I think that Tia told me the topic. Let me see here. I think she texted it to me. Are you there, Tia? /unmuted. No, I think she had to head out, but next week's lunch and learn will be insectary plants. So I'm not sure what that means exactly. And then I've got our speakers for the next month or so lined up outside of that. We'll have Dr. Selena Gomez from, not the singer. Her name is actually Selena Gomez from UF, Environmental Horticulture Department, the week after Tia, I believe. And then the week after that, we'll have Dr. Brian Unruh. His specialty is turf grass, and he's all the way up in the Panhandle at West Florida Research and Education Center. I think he was one of the main people that has been promoting the use of zoysia grass and looking into the research why we have zoysia grass as one of the main types of grass that we use in Central Florida now. And so that ought to be interesting to get his perspective on, a number of turf issues. And then we'll also, after him, I think we'll have Dr. Chris Marble from, he's from MREC. So I think most of you have probably seen him speak before, and he'll be covering various, like what is the best type of weed management regime to use in your home environment, and he'll go into all the details of that. So with that, I hope you guys learned something today and I didn't overwhelm you. I tried to have it be unified somewhat. I mean, because there's a lot more intricacy there to tree mechanics and tree physiology and the physics of all of it. I tried to keep it to the simplest that I could, and I hope I was able to keep you guys along without making it too uh, like specialized or full of jargon. So, but anyway, yes, I'll go ahead and send the PowerPoint out. So okay, with that, I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting, but if you need anything, go ahead and shoot me an email. That's still the easiest way for me to deal with stuff right now, to reach you guys. Any more updates on the status of plant clinics, including the satellites? Yes, satellites are currently, Lou Gardens, we know for sure will not be open anytime soon. MREC, it, like, as I mentioned, a lot of these things are going to be opening in phases. And like, I think MREC had 3 different phases to it. And that last phase, phase 3 is opening up to events, and they consider the plant clinic an event. So it could be a while before they start allowing that clinic to be active again. So, okay. With that, just like I mentioned, if you guys have anything else, just shoot me an email and I'll post this here shortly. I recorded this too, so I'll put it on YouTube. But over and out. Take care, everyone.